Hey now! Negro VMX here with another review of a SNES RPG that is a bit off the beaten track. Yeah, I know I said that I'd be doing some of the more well-known games here and there, but I am back at it with another obscure one this time, Romancing SaGa from Square. Romancing SaGa is a really interesting game in a lot of ways. For one, it's actually the fourth game in the series. The first three, SaGa, SaGa 2, and SaGa 3, were all released on the Game Boy and released in the United States as the Final Fantasy Legend 1, 2, and 3. The next three games in the series, Romancing SaGa and its two sequels, were released for the Super Famicom, but none of them were localized for release in the United States. Despite the fact that the Game Boy titles did in fact do well, they probably could have released it as Final Fantasy Legend 4, or maybe something else, but who knows. For whatever reason, they didn't do this, and that might have something to do with my next point. While keeping Romancing SaGa being the fourth in the overall series in mind, it's also important to note that it's sort of the first in its own series. Although there are elements of gameplay in the Game Boy titles that have indeed carried over, one thing that didn't was the setting. The Game Boy titles were very much a mixture of fantasy and sci-fi, with the third game in particular being an extremely sci-fi adventure. It involved time travel right from the get-go, for example. For Romancing SaGa, Square went with a fully fantasy world, and also a very different feel than what you might be used to if you played the previous SaGa games, or their other titles such as Final Fantasy, which might be why this stayed in Japan. The game lets you play as one of 8 characters, and you could recruit up to 5 party members to accompany you, either of them being any of the other 7 characters that were playable, or several additional ones. Once you finish your main character's opening scenario, you're pretty much dumped into an open world, and you have to figure out what to do on your own. There is an overall story, but it moves along at its own pace. More on that later, and you have to try to keep up. So yeah, Romancing SaGa stayed in Japan, though its remake on the PlayStation 2, Romancing SaGa Minstrel Song, was released here, though I decided on playing a fan-translated version of the original Super Famicom game on the Hygan emulator. I played it on Twitch on Saturday night streams where I played through the majority of this series. Now, one thing that I should mention before I get too far into this, though, is that although I'm reviewing Romancing SaGa, I will not be covering Romancing SaGa 2 or 3. The reason behind this is that Romancing SaGa 2, as of now, has not yet received a full fan translation. 2 different ROM hacking teams, SaGa Translations and Gilhide, have taken a crack at it, but neither are complete, and the Gilhide translation was last updated in 2002, and the SaGa Translations one in 1997. Yikes. It's a similar story for Romancing SaGa 3, with the most recent translation patch from Monosword last being updated in the year 2000. None of these are anywhere near complete enough to play all the way through, but luckily Square actually did release PC versions of those titles on Steam, which are what I'm playing through on Twitch. Although these look a lot like the Super Famicom originals, they're more remasters than ports. They have touched up graphics and sound, some extra content, they're in widescreen. It wouldn't be fair to call it a SNES review if I'm basing my opinions on a PC port released decades later. But I'll let you know now that, at least on Steam, Romancing SaGa 2 is pretty bad. It's far too hard and Byzantine. Basically, I could describe it easily by saying there's parts of the game that are fun, and there's parts of the game that are innovative, and there's absolutely no overlap between the two. Romancing SaGa 3 on Steam was a lot better than 2, though I still like the first game more. My only gripe about 3 is that while it's a much easier game to play than the first 2, no matter how much I went out of my way to grind to the point where all enemies and bosses died in 1 or 2 hits, I couldn't even come close to beating the final gauntlet of bosses. If you've ever played Octopath Traveler, you know what Romancing SaGa 3 is like. Anyway, that being said, let's get into it. I'll be rating Romancing SaGa on a scale from 1 to 10 in the following categories: graphics and presentation, music and sound effects, story and writing, gameplay and controls, and balance and difficulty. And as usual, I'll remind you of the way I do things. On a 10-point scale, 5 is average, not bad, 7 is good, not average. Yep, that still hasn't changed. So, Aesthetically, you might notice something very familiar about Romancing Saga. It looks a lot like Final Fantasy V. Everything about the game is remarkably similar as they shared artists and came out in the same year, though Romancing Saga was released in January and Final Fantasy V was in December, making them practically a year apart. This does at the very least explain why Final Fantasy V looks a little bit better overall, particularly in the battle backgrounds. Other games that came out in 1992 that I'm comparing Romancing Saga to include Dragon Quest V, Soul Blazer, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, and Paladin's Quest. And looking at those, and then looking back at Romancing Saga, my takeaway is that Romancing Saga looks fine. It's rather unremarkable for the most part. The character and enemy sprites are practically interchangeable with Final Fantasy V, and places all look like what they're supposed to look like. Aesthetically, it's fine. It's not super noteworthy. The times that I was impressed with it was the boss sprites, which can be large and detailed with lots of great colors, but speaking of colors, Romancing Saga feels slightly washed out and less vibrant than other games of the time, especially compared to the likes of Paladin's Quest or Soul Blazer. There's some animation to the characters, especially when they level up, but for the most part, it's just a slightly more plain-looking Final Fantasy V. The presentation is pretty good, which is actually a huge improvement over Final Fantasy and its gigantic bar of information at the bottom. When you need more menus to select attacks or spells, they pop up like word bubbles next to the relevant character. The menu is also very streamlined and simple. You select the character, and then you have options to change weapons, armor, or to use spells. It may seem odd that weapons and armor are separate, but, well, I'll get into why that makes sense when I talk about gameplay later on. Overall, its Spartan feel can be a bit of a drag when it comes to the battle backgrounds, which could use more detail and color, but the presentation being so sparse actually works for me. One thing that I should mention is that some of the dungeons in the game, while still not being very detailed or impressive, they just kind of look cool. While the graphics aren't anything to be impressed by, there's a lot of good design work put into the world of Romancing Saga. One thing that I thought was fantastic and maddening at the same time was the final boss. The final boss looks awesome, but the background that you fight him on has a completely different perspective from every other battle scene in the game, meaning that it winds up looking like your characters are floating in midair, which is not the best look, but at the same time, there's really cool things about this. Time actually passes during the battle, and the colors slowly change and get darker as you continue to fight him, and then finally moving towards dawn and bright colors towards the end. It gives you some hope as things lighten up as you're towards the end, but while also looking cool as hell and giving you an indication of how well you're doing in the battle. Things like this make it hard to give it a score. It's one of the most visually impressive things in the game, but at the same time it looks completely ridiculous due to the fact that the characters look like they're not actually standing on anything. And that's Romancing Saga in a nutshell. It looks fine, if not a bit dull for the most part. It has times where it can be suddenly very impressive and times where you wonder what the hell they were thinking. My overall impression is that for a game coming out in 1992, it looks fine, and the excellent presentation actually helps a lot. For graphics and presentation, I give Romancing Saga a 7 out of 10. For sound and music, once again, I'm reminded strongly of Final Fantasy V. In this case, it's not due to the composition of the songs, but rather the choices of instruments that were used, with a lot of strings and especially horns. The feel of walking from place to place is similar to that of Final Fantasy V. The composer, Kenji Ito, came to the series as of Final Fantasy Legend II, which had one of the best soundtracks on the Game Boy, and he would go on to work on a lot of game soundtracks, though a lot of his work was for the Saga and World of Mana series. There aren't a lot of songs in Romancing Saga, and sadly throughout the entire game I only heard a redone song from one of the Game Boy titles once. But everything else here that is here sounds great, and a lot of it would become iconic, the main Romancing Saga theme becoming the theme of the overall series. The sound effects for the most part aren't really all that noticeable. A lot of them sound like stock Final Fantasy sounds of clashing swords and enemies dying. You know, the usual sounds that do their job admirably, but you wind up taking them for granted. One moment, though, really wowed me. The sound of the final boss dying. It's one of the coolest things I've heard come out of a SNES. I mean, it really is just a mixture of rumbling ground and thunderclaps, but the stereo layering makes it sound appropriately epic, as it should be for the end to such an intense battle against a boss that is basically Satan. I have no real complaints about the music, and I enjoyed quite a bit of it, and only praise for the sound effects. So for music and sound effects, I give Romancing Saga an 8 out of 10. For story and writing, it's a bit difficult to talk about. I've only played through this once, but I'll give you my best impression. The overall backstory, told before you even start the game, is that 3 evil gods, Death, Sauron, and Shrirak, waged war against the good god, Elor, ages ago. Elor won the battle and stripped Death and Shrirak of their powers, and Sauron, who is the most evil of them all, was sealed away using 10 fate stones, which have now become scattered across the land of Mardius. You pick one of 8 characters, all of which have their own motivations, but they inevitably get drawn into the search for the Fate Stones and the battle against the awakening Sauron, who is influencing the evil spreading throughout the land. He's causing monsters to spawn endlessly, people to turn cruel and evil, and political conflicts to arise. I wound up choosing Albert, whose backstory is that he's the son of a lord who, along with his sister, fights the evil monsters in a cave near Isthmus Castle. However, shortly after the adventure, the monsters strike back and overwhelm Isthmus, destroying it, with Albert being the only survivor to seek other adventurers to do something about the monsters. Honestly, I was reminded of Dragon Age Origins, not just in Albert's personal story, which reminded me strongly of the human noble origin in that game, but the overall structure of the game. Once you complete your opening scenario, the game becomes open world. And now the story moves in a very different way. You go from place to place trying to find companions or get leads on Fate Stones, as well as finding people to help or to do quests for to increase your reputation as an adventurer and explore more of the world. While you're playing, things move along at their own pace, meaning that the other 7 characters that you didn't start as move around the world doing their own quests. You'll have to bump into them. They're almost always in a pub, and see if you could recruit them, though you can only have 5 companions with you, and there are other recruitable characters that aren't them. Not only do the other heroes move about and do things as you're playing, but other events take place, such as pirates attacking a town, or people going missing for sacrifices to some evil monster, or frontier villages being slowly overrun by monsters. The frontier thing is really jarring for such an old game. If you visit the frontier and its small settlements near the beginning of the game, you'll find tough people full of hope trying to make their way in an unforgiving wilderness. You might have no particular business in the area and come back way later, only to find that the entire area has been wiped out and devoid of human life. The change is actually gradual, though, with the monsters slowly overwhelming the frontier settlers, but it happens whether you see it happen or not. And since areas in this game are unlocked based on what characters you have with you or have spoken to, you may not even reach the area until late in the game, and then there are no settlers. This structure is fascinating and complex, and also endlessly frustrating. Many quests are only available early on in the game. If you fought too many battles, you'll find that you can't do the early quests. Another issue is actually progressing through the game can be somewhat difficult due to the other heroes constantly moving around. Without a guide telling you which cities they can possibly stop at, you may play for hours without meeting another hero, and then suddenly you might meet 3 of them in the same pub, kickstarting another part of the story. If you see something happening and you fail to act on it because you're busy with something else, you may find that it resolved itself and maybe not in the way you wanted it to. Sometimes you can't save everyone, and that, well, I mean, it's frustrating, but it adds to the tone of Romancing Saga. It's a harsh world out there. The writing is pretty good. Keep in mind that I am playing a fan translation here, but for the most part, people talk like you expect them to talk. There are a few so-called funny moments that are more annoying than anything. For example, the first few times that you journey to the town of South Estamir, a rather tawdry place, you'll be inundated by beggar children and thieves accosting you every step of the way, with refusing the children's demands usually followed by them yelling "screw you" and storming off. It's funny once, but it happens way more than once. Eventually, your reputation precedes you, and robbers and urchins will leave you alone. Another impressive thing is how the choices you make affect the world. You can wind up being a hero, or you can wind up doing some pretty nefarious things, including outright murdering people to get the items you need. This not only affects how the world in general views you, but how the game's ending plays out, with the game silently tracking your deeds and misdeeds and assigning you one of 3 penultimate dungeons depending on how good, evil, or neutral you are. My only real complaint is that very little of the actual gameplay has anything to do with the main story. The Fate Stones are out there to find, though due to having to cut content to get it all to fit on a Super Famicom cart, 2 of the Fate Stones are just not actually in the game at all. They were added later in remakes for WonderSwan Color and PlayStation 2. The Fate Stones themselves are almost all keyed to grand quests, but they're not really that important. You can try equipping them to give you a bit of protection against certain types of magic, but you don't need to actually get any of them to move the story along. You only need to keep fighting battles until the ending scenarios are available. It is of course more fun to do the big epic quests to move the story along, but I would have preferred if the lore important items like the Fate Stones were actually mandatory quests that had more impact on your character's narrative. That being said, this was 1992, and Romancing Saga was very experimental, and I have to say, I'm impressed by the building of the world and the way things move. It's not perfect, hell, it's not even smooth, but it does work. And that's a lot to say for a game that's trying to do so much with so little. For story and writing, I give Romancing Saga a 9 out of 10. For gameplay and controls, well, okay, you're sitting down, right? Are you not sitting down? I'll wait, sit down. Okay, we're good. There's a lot to talk about. Just the act of playing Romancing Saga is endlessly fascinating and also at times excruciatingly frustrating. This is a game that when it works, it's incredibly fun, and when it stalls, you just want to polymorph the video game into a person and then kick that person's ass. Firstly, I already mentioned the structure of choosing one of 7 heroes, doing their opening scenario, and then being kicked into the world. I recruited one of the other heroes, a warrior maiden named Sif, pretty early on, and a mage that I found in a pub that wasn't one of the important heroes. I was stuck with these 2 for a long time. I went from place to place trying to find scenarios and quests to do, but finding that there were a lot of areas that I just couldn't get to since they required me to have certain characters. The heroes are almost always found in pubs, but which pub? Who knows? Just keep checking each pub until you find them. Even a guide won't help all that much, it will only tell you which cities they might be in at any given time. Eventually, I was able to fill up my party with 6 of the 8 heroes, Albert and 5 companions, and things moved a lot smoother. For the combat, there are no random encounters. Instead, you can see the enemies wandering around, and most of them want to attack you, so they'll be moving towards you for the most part. While there aren't any random encounters, the encounters themselves are random, meaning that bumping into a little skeleton guy might give you an encounter with a few weak skeletons, or maybe one skeleton and several much more powerful enemies. Though there are several enemies that are bosses, almost all of the bosses can also be run into in the wild, and sometimes this happens very early. More on that later. Actually fighting enemies is a pretty straightforward affair, though the way the game handles getting stronger is a bit more unique. Out of the 3 previous Saga games, only Final Fantasy Legend III had a traditional experience point and leveling system, though the other 2 opted for espers that randomly gain stats and skills, or humans and robots that have to buy their way to becoming more powerful. In this game, inspiration is taken from the likes of Final Fantasy II, where each battle will give you a chance of certain stats being raised, though thankfully it's a lot less restrictive, meaning that you can gain health stats without being hit, or strength stats without attacking. Those stats for weapon skills and magic skills do require you to use those weapons or magic spells. Those level up pretty rapidly, and they only require your characters to do the action, not necessarily succeed at it. You'll fight a lot of battles in this, as every dungeon has hordes of enemies wandering around, so gaining stats happens almost constantly. It's handled a lot better than it was in Final Fantasy II, that's all I could really say there. Weapons are handled very differently. You can equip several weapons to a character, and when their turn comes up, each weapon has its own menu where you can attack with that weapon, or after it's been leveled up, you can use the skills that are associated with that weapon. Every weapon has 4 skills you can learn, and leveling up your skill with that weapon further will increase the amounts of times that you could use those skills. Some skills are extremely useful, such as ones that hit at range, and the ones that can instantly kill enemies, which actually works on bosses more often than you might think. There's only a few bosses near the end of the game that are immune to instant death attacks. The row system is similar to that of Final Fantasy V, though there's 3 rows instead of 2. Characters in the front row take more damage, but can deal more damage, and the opposite is in the back. The way I handle it is putting 2 characters in the front using swords, 2 in the middle using spears, which can hit enemies in the front from the middle row, and 2 with bows in the back, which can hit any enemy on the field. The issue is that you meet an enemy anything but head-on, your carefully chosen formation will be changed, either forcing your characters to waste turns moving forward or backwards on the field, or having to use skills to compensate. Battles with bosses tend to be fast and brutal. It usually ends by the second round. You either have died or the boss has. The only exception to this is the final boss, who takes a long time to kill, but is also very powerful. You'll need to either be really good at this point, or, well, I'll get into that later too. Magic is also kind of unique. You buy magic in towns, and there are different schools of magic. You can buy any school of magic, or any spell in that school for any character, though some of the schools are mutually exclusive. For example, you can't have both fire and water magic. I tended to go with an all-attacking strategy, so I taught everyone water magic, since it's easy access to a healing spell. Romancing Saga's gameplay is overwhelming, but if you take the time to learn how to play, it's incredibly satisfying to annihilate a boss in one turn. For gameplay and controls, I give Romancing Saga an 8 out of 10. For balance and difficulty, well, like I said earlier, it's a harsh world out there. This is a tough game that from the very beginning might bend you over and kick your taint until it's all the colors of the rainbow, and this can happen immediately. Pretty much my first few enemy encounters went about as you would expect them to, and then suddenly I ran into a boss and I got my butt handed to me. I don't mean that I tried to fight a boss, I mean an enemy encounter turned out to be a boss. Luckily, encounters are so random that you can run away from an enemy, take a few steps away from them, maybe heal up, re-engage that same enemy, and it might be the same enemy, but it might also be something different and easier to deal with. Enemies thankfully only respawn once you leave an area, and killing an actual boss tends to despawn all the enemies directly near you. And almost all dungeons at least have one shortcut out, but this is a game where everything can be going just peachy keen, and then suddenly you're facing against something new. Will you be fine, or is this a total party wipe? Who knows? Towards the end of the game, there are several bosses that are basically elementals. They guard important weapons that you might want. You fight them one at a time. However, while grinding for stats and money for better armor in an easy sewer dungeon, I ran into 3 of them at the same time. These sorts of things make playing Romancing Saga an incredibly scary prospect, as even the most well-equipped and well-prepared band of adventurers can run into the wrong enemy and be in real trouble, even in an area where you're supposed to be fighting frogs and skulls. Balance is almost non-existent. You'll either be blazing through hordes of enemies that can't even get a turn before you kill them, or you'll be struggling against or running away from enemies that can murder you with a glance. This being said, at the very least, it's very easy to run from battles. I don't think you can fail to run from battles in this, except against bosses where you're not allowed to even try. From my understanding, Romancing Saga's unique take on difficulty and balance would be improved by its sequels, but the original has some issues with them, especially since you can struggle through an insanely hard area full of intensely hard enemies, only to kill a boss in one strike. There's also good-bad glitches that crop up every once in a while that can wind up helping you. For example, selecting a skill that always goes first, like Falcon Slash, then canceling it and choosing a different skill, like the vastly more powerful Meteor Strike, will give Meteor Strike the priority of Falcon Slash. Another big one is the Obsidian Sword. It's a weapon that you can get late in the game that one of Sauron's minions will demand that you give to him. You're supposed to say no and then fight this guy as a boss, but if you just give him the sword, he leaves. This gives Sauron higher attack since he uses the sword in the battle, but it also makes it where he always, for some reason, mirrors the action of the final character in your lineup, meaning that you could cheese him by having this character walk forward and backwards constantly. I didn't do this, but I did make sure that that character healed me when I needed a break from Sauron's attacks, so Sauron would instead heal himself instead of attacking, and I was out-damaging his healing by quite a lot. Romancing Saga's balance and difficulty needs work. I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10 in that category. That all being said, Romancing Saga is one hell of an experience. It's full of great highs and pretty abysmal lows, but overall, it is a good experience, and the final score of 7.4 out of 10 reflects this. This is a good game that could have been great with just some tweaks, particularly to the enemy encounter system. I have to imagine the PlayStation 2 version probably addresses a lot of these issues, though I can't speak to that. Romancing Saga is a game that at times did get me incredibly frustrated, but I don't know, for some reason I always looked forward to returning back for more. So I may not be covering Romancing Saga 2 and 3, but well, I kind of gave my opinion on them already, and I wound up sort of not enjoying the series overall, but this one was pretty good. We'll see you next time.